So let me give you a couple examples of the difference between being vulnerable versus vulnerable leadership. And the thing about this is that we all know what it feels like to be vulnerable. We've all felt vulnerable in our lives, whether personally or professionally. We all know what that means. But very few know how to lead with vulnerability. So being vulnerable, I made a mistake. Being vulnerable, showing emotion. Being vulnerable, asking for help, talking about uncertainty. What I want to encourage you to do whenever you find yourself in these situations is to add the L. Add the leadership, right? I made a mistake. Here's what I learned. Here's what we're going to do to figure it out to make sure it doesn't happen again. I don't know how to do this, but here's what I'm going to do to figure it out. I'm showing emotion, but I'm also being self-aware and conscious so that I know how my emotions are impacting those around me, right? Talking about a personal challenge or struggle, but knowing that you're doing so with the intention to create trust. Add the L to the things that you talk about when it comes to vulnerability. Now, this is a very hard thing for people in general to do. In fact, there was a study that was done. Her name was Dr. Anna Bruck from the University of Mannheim. And she found that oftentimes when you imagine other people being vulnerable, like let's say Steve came up here and he started to share personal things and talk about some sensitive subjects, a lot of people would probably say, wow, that's brave. That's courageous. That's bold. So when we think about other people, we think of these positive attributes. But if I were to ask you, hey, will you come up here and talk about your personal challenges and struggles? A lot of people are going to say, are you kidding? People are going to think I'm an idiot. People are going to think I'm weak, I'm incompetent. I'm not going to do that. And so the challenge with vulnerability and why it kind of goes against our nature in some ways is because when other people do it, our perception of them is good. But when we imagine ourselves doing it, our perception is negative. It's bad. So I'm actually curious if anybody's bold in the audience to share a story of when you felt vulnerable at work. Bonus points if it's a very vulnerable story. In fact, one of the questions I ask a lot of CEOs is on a scale of 1 to 5, what has to be a 5 for you at work to make you feel that vulnerable? And so again, this goes against our very nature and ways of thinking about who we are as leaders. There's a story that's oftentimes told about a captain of a ship. And he's sitting writing in his log, and all of a sudden one of his officers interrupts him. And the officer runs into his room and says, Captain, we have a huge problem. And the captain says, yeah, what is it? And he says, well, there's a ship 15 miles ahead of us, and they refuse to get out of the way. And the captain says, well, tell them to move. And the sailor says, we did. They refuse. So the captain is annoyed. He goes over to the bridge. He gets on the radio, and he says, move starboard 10 degrees now. And he gets a message back. You move starboard 10 degrees now. And the captain's like, what the hell? Who's talking to me like this? So he gets back on the radio again, and he's like, this is Captain James T. Smith. And I'm ordering you to move starboard 10 degrees now. Message comes back on the radio. This is Fred. I'm ordering you to move starboard 10 degrees yourself. And at this point, everybody's looking at the captain. He's getting red. He is furious. So he sends out one last message. And he says, this is the USS Missouri. We are the largest, the greatest, the most powerful ship in the naval fleet. And if you do not move starboard 10 degrees now, then I am going to be forced to take action. A couple seconds later, the message comes back. This is the lighthouse. The point of that story is that sometimes, it's sinking in, I get it, okay. The point of the story is that sometimes we as leaders and as organizations view ourselves as these big battleships that don't need to change, that don't need to pivot. We can do things the way that we've always done, and that we can always get to our destination. But sometimes you're going to get to a point where you need to think differently, where you need to pivot. And a lot of this comes to just understanding the role of leadership and the stereotypes of leadership and how they've changed. I know there are a couple of people here that I've met that have been at the company for 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years. And I'm sure if I were to ask you, how has leadership changed, even inside this organization over the past several decades, you would say that it's night and day. I mean, these are actual magazine covers, and some of you might remember these magazine covers, which were published in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. The toughest babe in business. Can you imagine a headline like that being printed now? America's toughest bosses. And it was considered to be a badge of honor to be on this magazine. It was also considered a badge of honor to work for one of these types of leaders. And how things have changed over the past few years. Here's one of the CEOs that I interviewed. She's the CEO of a company called Wolters Kluwer, around 25,000 person company in the consulting space. And when I asked her, I said, you've been in the leadership world for a long time. Was vulnerability, was any of this stuff around emotional intelligence and leading with vulnerability taught to you? Was it discussed? And she said, I was in business school when Jack Welch was the CEO, and we were taught to be the celebrity leader. We were taught about command and control. We were taught to not show emotion. And so part of it is understanding it's not that leaders are bad, but we are going against some of the things that we've been taught, right? So there's a riddle of two people are in a car. It's a father and a son. Father and a son driving in a car. They get in a terrible accident. Father is killed. The son is badly wounded. He gets taken to the hospital, and he gets wheeled out on the operating table. And the doctor goes over there and says, I can't operate on this person. He's my son. Who's the doctor? Who's the doctor? The mom. And so this was an experiment that was done several years ago amongst a bunch of college students. And most people refused to believe even that the doctor could be female. They were trying to think of all these different ways, like the doctor's got to be a man. Right? It's part of the stereotype. It's part of how we think about different roles and schemas and scripts. So we have to break some of these things down, especially when it comes to leadership. So one of my favorite stories around just what leadership used to be like, and this was from the 90s. Some of you may know who Mindy Grossman is. She's the former CEO of WW, Weight Watchers, before they changed their name. And when I interviewed her, she told me this story when she was working at Ralph Lauren. And she was the president of CHROs. And she says, one day I show up to work, and I get to work, I'm about to get into the elevator, and into the elevator goes the CEO with her security detail, and also this other gentleman who runs the men's portfolio division. Our floor was the 12th floor, the CEO was on the 26th floor. And so they get into the elevator, the doors close, the CEO looks at the gentleman and says, you now report to her. The CEO then looks at her and says, you now run everything. The doors to the elevator open, they get out, CEO goes up to the 26th floor. And Mindy's standing there like, what the hell just happened? And she says, and the CEO told her, my secretary will get in touch with you, we'll schedule a meeting. So this was on a Friday, and a few hours later, she gets a call. The secretary calls Mindy and says, we need you to go to the CEO's apartment tomorrow, Saturday, 9 a.m. And Mindy's like, okay. So she talks to her husband. She says, I got to go to the CEO's office, the CEO's apartment at 9 a.m. And the husband already had a commitment. She couldn't get a babysitter, and she has a kid. And she's like, what the hell do I do? The CEO wants me to go there. I have my young child. What do I do? She shows up to the CEO's apartment with her stroller, with the child, and with a tape of Barney. And so they conduct their meeting, and they and while the child is watching Barney. And as Mindy is leaving, the CEO looks at her and says, that was a very bold thing that you did. And Mindy looks at her and said, no, it wasn't. That's just normal. And that was the last time she ever was asked to participate in a late meeting, an early phone call, or to do anything on the weekend. And I love this story because it kind of speaks to the traditional realm of leadership that we used to have that is now, I think, completely transforming for the better. So vulnerable leaders understand three truths. Right? These are three truths that you need to buy into in order to lead with vulnerability. The first one is leading from a place of connection and influence is more powerful than leading from a place of authority and power. If you want to get compliance, you lead from authority. You lead from power. But if you want to change the world, you lead from connection. You lead from trust. You lead from the relationships. The second truth that you have to embrace is that the opposite of being vulnerable is not invulnerable. It's stagnation and eventual decline. So one CEO, the CEO of Synopsys, Art DeGauss, he explained it to me like this. I said, how do you think about being a vulnerable leader? And he said, I think about it in terms of N+1. And he's an engineer, he's a scientist, very mathematical mind. And I said, N+1, what do you mean? And he says, today I'm the version of N. How do I get to be the N+1 version of me? Or the N+500 version of me? He said, I have to be vulnerable. I have to talk about things that I don't know how to do. I have to ask for help. I have to admit to mistakes. Because if I don't, I will never be that N+1 version of me. And he also said the danger is that you need to make sure that you don't go into the N- version of you. Meaning that if you do nothing and you remain stagnant, you don't change, you don't grow, you don't develop, while the world around you does change, you become N-. You become a lesser version of yourself. You become a less effective leader. And the third truth that I'm going to ask you to buy into is that the combination of vulnerability plus leadership has the profound impact to transform who you are, the profound impact to transform your team, and also the profound impact to transform your entire organization. So now the question becomes, why do it? Why do it? We all know leaders who are in their roles and they're not vulnerable, but they're leaders. We've all either worked for these types of people or we know these types of people. And so the question might be, well, Jacob, this is great, but so-and-so is not vulnerable and they're in a leadership role. So yeah, if they aren't doing it, I kind of don't need to do it either. Fair enough. So to answer that question, we turn to the Edith checker spot butterfly. And this butterfly it made Nevada its home for many, many years. And it flourished and it thrived in Nevada until, over time, man came into the area and they brought with them cattle. Now, the butterfly used to thrive in Nevada because of a plant called the blue-eyed Mary. And the blue-eyed Mary is the plant that the butterfly used to lay eggs on, used to eat. It was, the entire ecosystem was around this blue-eyed Mary. So eventually humans came in, they brought cattle with them, and along with cattle came a new invasive species of grass called ribwort plantain. And gradually over time, this new species of grass took over the blue-eyed Mary. It grew above the blue-eyed Mary, and so the butterflies had to adapt to the ribwort plantain, to this new type of plant. And this went on for several years until all of a sudden humans left. They decided to go elsewhere, they took their cattle with them, and they left. And when they left, the ribwort plantain also disappeared. But at that point, it was too late for the butterfly. The butterfly already adapted to this new plant. They couldn't go back to the blue-eyed Mary, and they all died. Now, the story does have a happy ending because years later, butterflies from other fields came and repopulated the area. This is known as mismatch theory. And what mismatch theory states is that there are attributes that were once very useful and beneficial to you. Things like command and control. Things like centralized decision-making. Things like not showing emotion. Things like not being vulnerable or asking for help. These were once actually useful and beneficial things for you as a leader, because that's what the business world looked like. That's what we were taught. That's what everybody did. So these things were once beneficial and useful to you. But what mismatch theory states is that attributes and qualities that were once beneficial to you become detrimental to you when the environment around you suddenly changes. So just like the butterfly that adapted to this other type of plant, when the environment suddenly changed, they died. And so that's what we're seeing in today's business world.